delighted to be part of the function this morning. You may wonder why the Chamber of Commerce is involved in homelessness. Well, for a number of reasons. Our members are extremely concerned about our society and the social issues that we face. And a recent poll that we did, homelessness and panhandling came up second after amalgamation, of all things, as a major concern of our members. In addition to that, personally, I'm involved in my company with GT Hiring Solutions and Chemistry Consulting, delivering employment services to people who are homeless. And even more personally than that, I actually lived on the street at the age of 14, and so understand those types of challenges and feel blessed to be here and be able to help a little bit to give back to the community. So I serve on the Coalition to End Homelessness Board with Andrew Wynne-Williams and Dean Fortin and Gordon Gunn, who are our co-chairs on that project, and delighted that we think we're making some progress. So before I get started, I'd just like to recognize a few VIPs in the room, and perhaps we can ask you to just wave or stand, whatever you like. First of all, our MP, Murray Rankin, federal MP. Murray, good morning. Hold your applause till the end if you did. I know you would get a standing ovation. Councillor Charlene Thornton-Joe, Councillor Marian Alto, Councillor Shelley Gudgeon, and Councillor Lisa Helps from the City of Victoria. Good morning, everyone. And I'd be remiss without acknowledging the Coalition founder, Mr. Ted Hughes, over here, and his lovely wife Helen, who has been very supportive of Ted. Good morning, and thank you for being here. So a round of applause for Thank you for coming. So this is Homelessness Action Week. Part of our activities at the Coalition is to increase awareness of the economic impacts of homelessness. And we're delighted that we've got a speaker here to address some of those issues. So we've invited Dr. Stephen Getz to speak to you. I'll give you a quick outline of Stephen's bio. Dr. Stephen Getz is a professor in the Faculty of Education at York University and is the director of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and Homelessness Hub. He's also the president of Raising the Roof, a leading Canadian charity that focuses on long-term solutions to homelessness. Dr. Getz is committed to a research agenda that foregrounds social justice and attempts to make research on homelessness relevant to policy and program development. His research on homeless youth is focused on their economic strategies, health, education, legal and justice issues. And more recently, he has focused his attention on policy and in particular the Canadian response to homelessness. Through his many roles, Dr. Getz publishes policy-relevant research, including The Real Cost of Homelessness, Can We Save Money by Doing the Right Thing, is the title of his book. I'd like to ask Stephen Getz to come up and deliver his presentation. Thank you. There are notepads on your table. We're going to do a Q&A afterwards, so I'd like to ask if you could just write down your questions for Stephen, and we'll do a little round session later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm delighted and honored to be here to be able to speak with you today. And I'm delighted that so many people came out to listen to an academic. So there's always one birdie falling. So anyway, this is a topic, the cost of homelessness, that I think is really important, because I think in Canada and in communities across Canada, we're kind of at a turning point in terms of how we're thinking about what to do about homelessness. One of the things, and you'll see in my slides, one of the things that happens when homelessness emerges as a crisis, becomes very visible on the streets, is that we rush to deal with the emergency. And because we see that person there and we want to do the right thing. And so we put a lot of energy into emergency services and supports. On the one hand, that's the nice thing. On the other hand, we often use policing as a way of dealing with the visibility of homelessness. And while that's important, we always need the emergency response. Most places, and I've done research around the world, most places at a certain point start saying we have to do things differently because it doesn't make sense. We have to focus on prevention and moving people out of homelessness. And I'll just tell you a quick story to sort of illustrate why this makes sense. Remember in 2003 there was a major fire outside of Kelowna, right? Big fire, starts to approach the city. Pretty soon houses on the edge of town start burning, then one's inside. At a certain point they had to evacuate 23,000 people out of Kelowna, out of the areas that were at risk. And so what did they do? A lot of people moved in with friends and relatives, so they would be couch surfing, I guess. Other people would rent motels and hotels, and even though it's a tourist spot, those filled up really quickly. And then at the end, what they did is they commandeered hockey rinks, because this is Canada, and gymnasiums, and put mats on the floor and gave people bagged lunches. And that was an emergency response. Now, if you went back to Kelowna today, and you went into a hockey rink and you saw mats on the floor and people living there still, you would say, that was a disaster. We've done something horribly wrong. And I kind of feel that's how we've dealt with homelessness in Canada. The emergency services are important, but that's not a solution to homelessness. Right? We have to do things very differently. And so I'm going to talk about some of the economics of why to do it. We need to do something differently because A, it's the right thing to do. B, I think we know a lot more about what to do. And C, it's going to be more cost effective in the long run. And all those are three wins. But to do that, it requires the whole community. So it's interesting, we have municipal, provincial, federal politicians here. We have the business community, and you are so important to this. Everybody has to be part of the solution to homelessness. So I'm going to give you some highlights from a report, and then at the end I'm going to talk about some new things that we're getting ready to roll out. And at the end, I'm going to say a few things that you might find outrageous. If you don't, then I haven't done my job. So let's go. Fasten your seatbelt. Everyone have coffee? Good. That's always a key thing at 8 in the morning. Okay. Let's start. First, I'm from the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. We're a national research consortium. Bernie's part of this, where our goal is really to take research and mobilize it so it has a bigger impact on policy and practice. And that's and we work locally, regionally, and nationally to try and do these kinds of things, because I think research can have an impact. Sometimes in the past, people would say to me, we don't need research on homelessness, we know what the problem is, we know what the solution is. There was an anti-intellectualism. I always thought that was odd. Like, what issue area in the world would you not want research on? Right? We need evidence in terms of what to do. So let's turn to some of that evidence. Let's first talk about understanding homelessness, because you can't solve a problem unless you understand the causes. Now, homelessness is something that individuals experience, right? They lose their housing. But homelessness as a problem is something different. Homelessness is a societal problem where we're not doing what we need to do to ensure that when people are in crisis, that they move through that as quickly as possible, or we stop it from happening, right? We've created a homelessness problem in Canada, and the interesting thing is we know what we did, and if we know what we did, we know what to do next. Okay. The creation of homelessness is a major crisis in Canada, basically emerged because of a number of shifts that started in the 1980s and 1990s in Canada. Important policy shifts. Canada began a massive disinvestment in housing at that time. Austerity measures have become the norm. And we've had cuts to welfare and social spending, or at least they haven't been able to keep up, right? So there's policy shifts that are important there. In terms of housing, we moved from seeing direct investment by the government as the key to creating low-income housing to letting market forces, to using tax incentives to increase the housing supply. I benefited from that. I used my RSPs in the 1990s to fund one down payment of my house. That was a tax measure, a tax incentive that I made use of. Other people did as well. So the idea was then that we would shift from that government role of being the key funder to letting the market take place. And I'm going to comment on the success of that later. The other things we've seen in Canada are shifts in income. So over the past 25 years, the key thing to note is that the middle 40% of Canadians have seen their income stagnate or rise moderately. The bottom 40% of Canadians have seen their incomes drop. This depends on community by community. Certainly the case in Ontario. And the top 20% have seen increases in their income. But we've also seen the decline in the affordable housing supply. And because that investment, or that shift to tax expenditures, to tax incentives to create low-cost affordable housing, that really hasn't worked, right? It's a 25-year-old experiment, and the results are in. It hasn't worked. We've seen a massive shift, and I'll talk about that later, to investment in building private single-family residences and condominiums. But we haven't seen it. The amount of rental housing that's been building in Canada has been shrinking steadily since that time. The outcome of all these shifts is that we've seen a rise in homelessness. When I moved to Toronto in the 80s, there were some people who were homeless because bad things are going to happen no matter what you do. But in the 90s, it started to mushroom and balloon. You started to see people on the streets more. You started to see more panhandling and squeegeeing. In neighborhoods where there was never people who were homeless, they started to appear everywhere. Now, that didn't happen because a lot of people decided they didn't want to work, or they were lazy, or they wanted to be on the streets. That happened because the changes in the economy and the lack of supports and the lack of housing created the conditions where people couldn't stay housed. And we're living with that situation today. You have to give me the signal, like, I'm going too long, because I'll talk forever. Andrew said half an hour, so if I translate that into Toronto, that's like 40 minutes. But anyway, I'll get through. So, the other thing we need to know is the causes of homelessness. If you ask somebody why they're homeless, they will tell you their personal story, because that's their experience of it. These things happen to me. And so interpersonal things do play a role. You lose your job, catastrophic health issue, death in the family, family conflict, addictions issues, mental health issues in the family and the household. All of these things can contribute to a person's individual story. But we can't understand homelessness if we only focus on those individual factors, right? And you have to be, as I say, if you ask someone, they're going to talk about that. But people will not say this, right? If you ask someone why they became homeless, they're not going to say, my problem started when the government of Canada canceled its national housing strategy in 1993, right? They will personalize it. But we have to understand all those factors, the lack of affordable housing, increased poverty in this country, discrimination. We have to get over ourselves if we think this is a nation where, that racism is an American problem. It's a big problem here as well. Homophobia produces youth homelessness, right? So there's lots of violence, interpersonal violence, violence against women, all of these factors. These aren't about an individual and their failings or bad things. These are structural problems that matter. And then the final thing we have to look at is systems failures. We produce homelessness in a number of ways. For one thing, our child protection laws are antiquated, right? The fact that that when you're 19 in this province, you're done if you're in care is maybe made sense in the 1970s when you could get a job, a full-paid job, but it doesn't make sense now. Young people stay home. How many people here have kids? Okay, just so you know, they're never leaving home, right? The percentage of young people in Canada, based on the last census, between the 20 and 29, not 20 and 25, but 20 and 29, the percentage who live with their parents is 42%. Right? And they're not staying home because it's like, oh, I love it when you ask me personal information. I love it when you request that I come home at a certain time. It's because they can't afford to move out. So we have in place systems that haven't moved with the times. We discharge people in our Get Tough on Crime strategy in Canada. We've cut back on discharge planning and support for people leaving corrections. We're holding people on remand for longer periods of time. And they lose their housing and their jobs while they're waiting trial. And that Get Tough on Crime policy, it's interesting because it's actually a crime production strategy. Because if you discharge people from prison into homelessness, their chance of reoffending goes through the roof. So what are we doing? That's bad policy in action. So you can see that homelessness involves many kind of things that, as a society, we can address. We can't necessarily prevent a person from experiencing, a bad thing happening, but those broader structural factors we can move on. Okay, so how big is the problem? I'm going to go through this quickly. We didn't have good numbers in Canada until about a year ago. So annually, there are about a minimum of 200,000 people who experience homelessness. On a given day, that's about 30,000 people across the country. Single adult males between 20 and 25, or 25 and 55 make up the bulk of the population, but that's just the people who are in the shelters. It doesn't count invisible homelessness. Women are less likely to show up in the system, and I think that's because of the incredible violence and exploitation that happens on the streets. So many women will stay in unhealthy, unsafe situations rather than go onto the streets. But family violence is a major cause of homelessness for women, and it's an issue that requires its own focus. And youth homelessness is a big deal. For a 10-year, or a group of people between 16 and 24 makes up 20% of the homeless population. That's I'm not sure what the figures are for Victoria, but that's a major overrepresentation. And if we don't focus on youth homelessness in a very targeted, specific way, we're going to be creating those adult, chronically homeless people down the road. So here's a key table. This is from a guy named Yale Belanger at Lethbridge. And this shows the percentage of people who are Aboriginal, or people who are homeless who are Aboriginal in communities across Canada. Now, people who are Aboriginal make up 4.6% of the Canadian population. In virtually every community, they're overrepresented in the homeless population. I don't know if we have Victoria on this one. No, we don't. But you can see as you move farther west and north, the percentage of the population that's Aboriginal increases. We cannot talk about homelessness in Canada anymore without talking about Aboriginal homelessness. Right? And that means not just that we have to recognize it, but we have to figure out how do we work with Aboriginal communities in the process of addressing that issue. Okay. Chronicity. Here's an interesting figure, or set of figures. Andrew, you apparently have been doing some new work on this issue, right? Most people who experience homelessness move in and out in a fairly short period of time, which doesn't mean that that's okay, because it can be traumatic and have longer lasting effects. But the percentage of people who are long-term chronically homeless is quite small, right? It's, between 2 and 4% of people have been homeless for over a year. Many are homeless for 20 years, that kind of thing. But they tend to use up most of the shelter beds and services. So it's an important component of the population. And we're going to come back to that. So you need to remember that that percentage who are chronic or episodically homeless, that's people who move in and out, is much smaller than the total number. But that also points to what we need to do. Now let's go to the Canadian response. As I mentioned in my opening comments, there are 3 things you can do to address homelessness. You can stop it from happening in the first place through prevention. You have to have an emergency response because bad things will happen. And you need good models of housing and supports. This is my depiction of where we put our energy in Canada until recently, but things are starting to shift. And part of the reason why we're starting to shift is that we're realizing that relying on that emergency response is actually really expensive, because in the past I think we've kind of said, well, sure, sleeping in a room with 20 people is not great, but at least people have shelter and they're getting some food, right? And it's, after all, in these times of austerity, this is the best we can do, right? It's not, we call it a charitable response often because it involves charitable donations, but it's actually very expensive. It's counterintuitive, but it is. And I'll explain why. We did a calculation at the Canadian Observatory on homelessness with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness using data from the At Home Chez Soi project, which is the biggest research project on housing first ever done anywhere in the world, and calculated that the annual cost to the Canadian economy of sustaining homelessness as it is $7 billion. Now you need to think about that. That's money that could be used elsewhere. You also need to think about that as we move forward towards an election next year, where we're starting to see some fiscal room develop at the federal level anyway. Why does it cost so much? The key thing is that when someone is homeless, there's the cost of the direct homeless service provision. So the shelter stays, the emergency services, the soup kitchens, the day programs, those kind of emergency supports. But there are also health care costs. The longer you are homeless, the worse your health will be. The research on that is very, very clear. Your health declines. Your ability to access mainstream services is often put in jeopardy because depending on where you are, if you have to have a health card and your health card gets robbed, you're going to have barriers to access. There's discrimination because there's stigma attached to people who are homeless. Right? And so when they use health services, it tends to be through the door of the emergency department. People who are homeless also wind up in trouble with the law more, and I'll explain that later as well. And so we actually have been able to calculate some of those costs, right? Like how much does it cost to stay in a shelter versus time in a psychiatric hospital or regular hospital versus in a prison. And this is from a study in Toronto in 2007, and it shows, I'll just go through this quickly. I hate when people read slides, but it's pictures, so I can read it if I want, right? So like the average per person monthly cost of keeping someone in an emergency shelter is $1,900. If they are staying in a hospital, it's $11,000. If they're in a provincial prison, it's over $4,000. The cost of rent supplements would be $700. The cost of being in social housing would be $200. Now there may be additional costs of supports for the person, but just that shelter, right? Like right there it's showing you that maybe the money's going in the wrong place. We need to think about it differently. And as I mentioned, health declines. The research on this is very extensive. A lot of the things we associate with homelessness, things like addictions and mental health problems, sometimes, well, first off, not everybody who's homeless has an addictions problem, right? Not everybody who's homeless has a mental health problem. But we do know that sometimes those factors can lead to homelessness, but most certainly being homeless can lead to those things. I've never been homeless myself, but I kind of figure that there's two things that I think for sure. One is I would be drunk every single night to take away the pain. The other is I get myself a big mean dog because it's so unsafe and the risk of trauma on the streets is great. And I don't even like dogs, right? But you know, a cat doesn't have quite the same impact in terms of making me feel safe. So it's no wonder that people on the streets are going to self-medicate because they get not only physical abuse and violence, but they get personal abuse. I used to do street outreach with young people in Toronto, and you'd be sitting down talking with people, and passers-by say things. Passers-by who look like me would come by and say things that would just stun you. It's like, you disgust me, get a job, racist stuff. And so like there's a constant barrage that undermines people's sense of self-worth, right? And so it's no wonder that the depression rates go up when you become homeless, mental health problems increase, these kinds of things, and then people self-medicate. When people, so this is just some quick stats on the higher prevalence rates of common illnesses and afflictions. Stephen Wong is a researcher, a leading health researcher, and he suggests that homelessness reduces your life expectancy by 20 years, right? He also did this interesting project where he used administrative data from a hospital and compared the annual expenditures in hospital for people who are homeless versus those who aren't, right? And because people who are homeless, their health problems become more acute and more serious when they wind up in the hospital, it tends to, first, it's more often. Second, their stays in the hospital are longer because the problems are so serious. And he calculated that the expenses are 5 times what it is for house people. 5 times. And here's the other thing. If someone's in a hospital for a serious illness and we discharge them into a shelter, the chance of that condition getting worse go up. So it makes no sense. But it also points to where we need to be thinking about solutions. Now corrections, involvement with the justice system. People who are homeless wind up in trouble with the law for all kinds of reasons. Again, those things I was just talking about. If you're homeless, a lot of what you do happens in public. Things that everybody else does in private. If I want to have a drink tonight, I won't be doing it on a street corner. because I have money and I can go into a bar or drink at home. If I'm tired, I don't have to sleep on a park bench because I'll go into my house and close the door. When you're homeless, the street becomes your living room because you don't have private space. That annoys people. They don't want to see that. But it's not the person's fault that they don't have a door they can close. They're in public. So often we ask the police to intervene. Can you do something about it? Right? And so the police do. And in Toronto, in Ontario, they passed in the 1999 the Safe Streets Act, which basically outlawed panhandling and squeeging. It was for the language of the law said aggressive panhandling and squeeging, but they wrote it so broadly that it means that the police could do whenever they want. For instance, you cannot panhandle in a place where the public frequents, which is kind of like everywhere. So technically they can do that. And I'm going to just show you something in Toronto. This is the number of tickets issued for Safe Streets Act violations over an 11-year period. And what you need to know is that during that time, the percentage of people who are homeless who panhandle and squeegee dropped precipitously. There's all kinds of research that shows that, including the City of Toronto's own research, right? And this is partly because of the ticketing. But you can see in 2000 there was around 700 tickets issued. By 2005, it spiked up, and that was partly because there was a public scandal because somebody got stabbed by a homeless person, and therefore every homeless person is a potential murderer, right? And by 2010, 15,000 tickets were issued, right? These are tickets issued that are minimum $70, but can be up to $500. So someone's panhandling for coins, and you give them a ticket for $70, and what should they do? Panhandle more to pay for the ticket? Sell drugs? Like, it's a policy flaw and failure. What can happen when you don't pay tickets is you can go to jail. So we did a cost analysis. This is just the City of Toronto, and it doesn't account for all the tickets people get when they're homeless, because they're more likely to get tickets for drinking in public or loitering. Just Safe Streets Act violations. Number of tickets issued, 67,000. The minimum value of that was $4 million. $4 million of debt placed on people who are living in acute poverty. And the cost of issuing the tickets, this is just the policing time, was $1 million. Not the court times, nothing else. That's bad policy. That's a waste of money, right? And the other thing is that over 99% of those tickets don't get paid. But here's what happens if you're homeless. The city in Toronto, I'm not sure how it works here, but what the city does is when tickets aren't paid after a 30-day period, they sell the debt to collection agencies. So a homeless person gets housed after a couple of years. 2 weeks later, there's a knock on the door, and somebody says, you owe us $4,500 for tickets, right? And we don't have anything built in that will excuse people from that debt. Bad policy. But again, it's a reaction to the visibility of homelessness. So changing direction. Can we do things differently? I'm moving very quickly now. Yes, we can. We need to go from something like this, and this is where we're learning a lot. We need to move from this to something that looks more like this, where we rebalance things. Let's focus more on prevention. Let's focus more on moving people into housing. And so how do we get there? We need planned approaches where we have realistic targets about where we want to get. We need strategies to reduce the number of people who are homeless. We should target those chronically homeless individuals for sure, but we have to do much more. We need all levels of government involved in this. It's one of the things in Canada that's complicated because the buck gets passed. Where's the province in this? Where's the federal government? Where's your local government? Where are Aboriginal governments? And so one of the key interventions that's gained a lot of traction is Housing First. And it's quite controversial in ways that it shouldn't be, and it's also controversial in ways that it should be. And that's based, the latter comment is about how it's implemented. At its most basic, Housing First says that people will do better when they're housed. You shouldn't have to wait. You shouldn't have to prove you're ready. Because you know what? When I was born in the 1980s, I didn't have to demonstrate that I was ready to move into housing. Like, that would be absurd. When I was a teenager, I didn't have to demonstrate to my parents that I was worthy of being sheltered. Yet we often, with homelessness, do that. It's like, well, you have to deal with your addictions issues first, or we want to stabilize your mental health issues. And it's like, that is crazy. It's being homeless that's making me drink, right? The idea is if you give people housing and give them the supports they need, they will do better and they will recover. And so I'm going to go through this quickly because I don't have much time. There's lots of good writing that explains how this works, but the core principles are about a client-driven approach where people get housing without preconditions. They have choice around what kind of housing. It doesn't mean I want to live in a mansion, but it does mean I might have an opinion about what part of town I want to live in, that kind of thing. We tailor the services and supports to the needs of the individual rather than make the individual match the program. This research project I spoke about before, the largest one ever done in the world, is an amazing body of research. And what it has shown is that if you house people with Housing First and give them the right supports, 80 to 90% of people will remain housed. And this is kind of counterintuitive because the polls, I don't know what your local polls show, but the polls that have been done nationally suggest that the majority of Canadians believe that people who are homeless choose to be homeless, that they don't want to work. And in fact, the actual evidence suggests otherwise. You can take that person in Victoria on the streets who's been homeless for 20 years, and if you house them and provide them with the right kind of supports, you know what? They will stay housed. Right? So we know what to do. We know what the intervention is. And the other thing that's interesting is that we also know that it saves money. And this At Home Should Swap project has amazing economic data. There's an economist from Montreal named Eric Latimer who's done all this work. When people are housed, they use emergency less. Their running with the police are less. Their health conditions stabilize. Their health improves. Their connection to community increases. But it also saves money. Oops, I'm missing a key file there. Okay. Which is, sorry, I gave you a little sneak preview. But this is a key thing they found. That for the hardest, most difficult, chronically homeless people with acute mental health and addictions issues, for every $10 you invest in Housing First, your return is over $22 because there are cost offsets to other systems. It doesn't mean you need less police, although one might argue that. It doesn't mean you need less health care provision, but it means you can do different things. There's opportunity costs in there, right? So you can reallocate resources to where they need to be. We shouldn't be wasting taxpayer money, to use that kind of language, on policing people who are homeless. We should be housing them. Okay, so I'm going to end by talking about some of the things that are going to get in the way. First off, Housing First is a evidence-based intervention that works, but we have to do so much more. We have to address chronic homeless people, but we have to do more. We have to address the needs of women who are fleeing violence. We have to address youth homelessness. There are a whole bunch of things we have to do, but one of the key underlying factors that's going to get in the way, and this goes back to the beginning where I talked about how did we create this problem of homelessness, is we have to address the affordable housing issue in this country. And here's where I'm going to start to say things that some people might find troubling. This one they won't. But we're about to release a report, I'll explain it in a minute. But one of the things that economists show is that 18% of all low-income Canadians live in what's called extreme housing need. That means they're spending more than 50% of their income on housing. And it's important to distinguish that from people who are higher income, because if I'm spending 50% of my income on housing, that doesn't affect in any way my ability to buy food, right? And to meet other needs, because I have more money and more room in my budget to do other things. But if you're earning $18,000 a year, and you're paying over 50% of your money on housing, something's got to give. Transit, food, gifts for friends, hygiene products, cable, mobile phone, right? What's your cable and mobile phone bills combined, right? Not having enough money is a serious factor that puts a lot of people at risk. And so here's a table that we have in our new report, and I'm going to explain this. This is looking at the amount of money that Canadians contributed per capita to spend on affordable housing over the last 25 years. Right, so it's adjusted for constant dollars. So in 1989, through our federal expenditures, Canadians spent per capita $115 on affordable housing. That's declined. You can see the blip here during the economic crisis where there was an investment in housing that was short term. But it's now down to $62 per Canadian. And that's even a high figure because it includes homelessness partnering strategy money, which doesn't really lead to new builds at all, right? So it's about $58 per Canadian. $58, right? And what I'm going to say now is a thing that maybe offends people. But, you know, as I said, that experiment about letting the market produce low-income housing, the results are in that that hasn't worked. We have to start asking ourselves, is it time to reinvest? We go around the world saying Canada's a great country because we know how to balance a budget. Other countries don't. But you know what? That came at a cost, an infrastructure cost. Right? If we were to put this back to $115, right, which would be an increase of, here's my math skills, you know, like a $52, $53 a year, that's $1 a week per Canadian. The total cost would be about $4 billion annually compared to what we're spending now, right? We can afford that. There's fiscal room appearing at the federal level. We don't even have to raise taxes to do this, but we do need to invest in it. I'm going to show you this table quickly, and this shows that trend in change in rental housing builds. You can see that you know the shift in building and housing has moved from rental properties, which were say 30%, 25 to 30% in 1990. Now it makes up a small amount. The investment in housing builds is almost entirely in condos and private homes. We also changed tax laws, by the way, in the 1980s and 90s that created a disincentive for developers to build rental housing. So here's a table, and this is by an esteemed scholar named Bernie Pauly, who, I say that because I just want to say this, that in this community, like I do a lot of work across Canada, you are fortunate to have someone like her as a researcher who does this great engaged work with the community that helps you figure out what to do. That's a little plug for Bernie there. So Bernie and Andrew and his team did this research on vacancy rates in Victoria. So when you look at vacancy rates as an indicator of housing risk, vacancy rates tell you about what supply is available on the market. It doesn't tell you how many units overall are available, but it tells you about that. And so over this period of time, 2006 to 2012, the number of units that were available at any given time is kind of constant, right? So is that a crisis? Looks like the same thing. Nothing's really changing. But if you watch this, Bertie, this is magic, right? If you overlay what's happened in terms of the availability of low-cost housing, you can see it's declined quite dramatically, right? So almost all the units in 2006, bachelor units, were, you know, less than 700 a month were available. That's declined dramatically. If you also look at single or one-bedroom units, that market's starting to collapse. Right? So the vacancy rate is constant, but it doesn't tell you about the affordable vacancy rate. And so we need to really think about that as a community, right? How are we going to address that lack of affordable housing? It's an affordability issue because the cost of housing goes up, incomes are not, whether you're working or on benefits, are not keeping pace. We have to do something to increase the affordable housing supply. And so coming soon in our next State of Homelessness in Canada report, we're launching it on October 27th in Vancouver. We're going to outline things that can be done to create a new investment in affordable housing in Canada. And it's not going to make people broke. It's not asking for people to do anything unusual. It's asking us to return to what we used to do, but with some new ideas. And so before we go for questions and comments, I just want to make an announcement about the next launch of your coalition's public awareness campaign. This is released today. Another thing I want to say about Victoria, Andrew knows that I believe this profoundly, but you are fortunate to have this coalition do this public awareness work in a very sophisticated way, right? Because here's the thing. Politicians are not going to move on homelessness until the public demands it. That's my belief, right? Policy is not driven by a good idea or evidence. what will get it going is fire under the feet. And so we have to communicate to the public and shift ideas about the way things work. And so this, I love this one, right? Because it's okay to use humor as well. These things get released. They get transmitted through Twitter. If you've got your cell phone out, maybe you can tweet this one right now. And these are wonderful. I want to thank the Chamber of Commerce in the City of Victoria, Downtown Victoria Business Association, for the opportunity to speak. And I think now we're going to have some time for questions. Didn't go too far over time. I did go Toronto half-hour time. Thank you.
That was very enlightening. Thank you very much. We do have a few questions. Andrew, I think, is coming around to grab some of them. But I have quite a long one here from Bruce Carter at the Chamber. He's testing me, I think. Can I read this much? Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. You talked about being able to save money by having ICSS use of emergency wards. The savings could be transferred to homeless savings. For this to be true, we have to assume that the emergency ward services could be cut back if homeless folk visit less. However, emergency rooms are overcrowded, and a reduction in homeless visitors would not likely result in emergency room capacity reductions. How many of these savings are real?
That is a good question, and it is about cost offsets and opportunity costs. And so in some cases the savings will be real. So if people aren't staying in shelters, you're going to save those costs directly. But the other costs to other aspects of government, it does mean you can do things differently. And having people not use Emerge isn't going to like overnight change things, but it will. If you've had to wait in Emerge, as I think everybody probably has, you do know that that's a big deal. So these cost offsets, it's about opportunity costs. It means you can do something differently. And most certainly, if we have fewer people who are homeless and having lengthy stays in hospital, that's better for them. It's also better for the system, right? Because hospitals shouldn't also be a place where we house people who are homeless. We're spending money to house them in a hospital bed rather than in their own place, right? So this isn't like a totally free solution, but it does mean that we can do things differently. There will be some direct cost savings and then some indirect ones as well.
Next question. How do citizens influence all levels of government to work better together, the issue of homelessness in our communities?
I think there's a lot of things that can be done. I think the public awareness piece is really key because there are those misconceptions about homelessness. There's a lot of stigma, right? So I think the first thing the public needs to do is to understand it more. And I don't criticize people for not knowing everything about homelessness because there's lots of things I don't know. We are all very busy people. But from both a justice perspective and as a society, I think it's fair enough that the public should start demanding that we do something around homelessness. And the key thing for people to understand is that we have to do more than just say this system is broken, because that doesn't help. That's like going up to someone and saying, wow, that's a horrible stab wound you've got there, but there's nothing we can do. I think that where we have to go is that we have to say that the way we're dealing with the public has to put the heat on not just politicians, but the community at large, because it's everybody's problem. We have to put the heat on and say that the current situation isn't okay, it's not acceptable, and we also know things that we can do to make it a lot better. And that this is going to require an investment in some cases, but it will draw down savings in other areas, but it's something we have to do. The economic argument isn't enough alone, and I would never talk about issues around justice in those terms exclusively, but we can do a better job, and it's not going to cost us what we think it will. So we need to put that pressure on. I think that affordable housing question, that's an issue for everybody, because as I say, all of you with children, your children are going to want to move out someday. Affordable housing is an issue for everybody. We can address that issue, and that can contribute to an end to homelessness in Canada. So we can do multiple things at the same time.
Thank you. I hope there is hope for our children. I've got 7 of them. I still got 2 left at home. I'd like them to get their own place at some point. Thank you. You spoke of housing first with appropriate supports. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by appropriate supports?
Okay, this will depend on the person, their age, their needs, their health issues, mental health issues. And Housing First is a flexible model where you actually have to do a triage and determine what the needs are. But for adults, it basically falls into 3 buckets. The first is housing supports. That's help with finding housing, working with landlords, helping people do basic skills around housing, helping people stay housed, troubleshooting when things go wrong, that kind of thing, and including rent supplements. Because for many people who are homeless, they will never be able to earn enough money to maintain their housing. So there has to be that investment in helping get people housed. So housing is the one area of supports. The next is around health, right? And that means helping people improve their, take a wellness approach, so help people deal with their health issues, improve their health, eat better. That's why income is important, right? A harm reduction approach that understands that we have to deal with addictions where people are at. We have to do these kind of things, get people access to mainstream services, right? So they stop accessing services through Emerge, get their health stabilized. And then the third thing are what are called complementary supports, and this involves a range of things. First, basic life skills, because some people may not have the skills to run a household, pay bills, that kind of thing. Other people will, right? But some people need that kind of support. But it also involves helping people engage with communities, right? Meaningful engagement with other people, developing friendships, engagement in meaningful activities, whether it's volunteering, arts, sports, going back to school, those kind of things, right? Because for a lot of people, if they're young, they won't necessarily have those skills worked out. But if you've been homeless for a long time, you may have lost a lot of that and be beaten down a lot. So if we help people re-engage and connect with communities, then they're going to do better in life, like anybody, right? And so again, it's matching the supports to the person. Some people will need minimal supports. They just need help getting the housing, getting started, getting first and last rent, and off they go. Other people are going to need high level of supports for the rest of their life. And that's just the reality. But certainly if somebody has acute mental health problems, it makes no sense to house them in emergency shelters. That's just, to me, that's an unethical solution to that problem. We need to house them and give them the supports they need and help them stay housed.
Thank you. Next question is, what were the tax changes made that caused housing construction to decrease in the 80s and 90s?
I'd have to go back to the economists who prepared that information for us. There was a number of subtle changes that basically created the incentive to shift at the federal level to increasing investment in private homes. And some of those are ones that individuals benefit from, right? All of us benefit from home ownership, those of us who own. How many people here are renters? Okay, a lot of people are renters. So homeowners get all kinds of tax advantages as well, right? And that creates the market demand as well. The profit return for condos and private homes is different for developers as well because it's a shorter term return. So I can send you details on exactly what those are. We have them detailed, but I don't have them at the top of my head. And if people want that information, I can get that to them. We're releasing another report with that information in as well.
Canada's population is aging. Life expectancy for a homeless person is reduced by approximately 20 years, but our homeless people are aging too. Isn't this a new issue for homelessness?
It's an interesting issue. This is absolutely, it is an issue. It's one that's being recognized in the United States and also in Canada. The homeless population is aging, and our emergency systems aren't geared to do elder care. Right? And so a lot of the problems that the elderly face when they're housed are more acute when people are homeless. So, yeah, that's an issue that I think in communities across Canada people are recognizing, and we have to figure that one out. Right?
Okay, let's save the best for last. Oh, sorry, 2 more questions. How does homelessness affect tourism in Victoria, streets lined with folks in need of assistance?
That's a question that always comes up, and that came up in Toronto when we put in the Safe Streets Act, and I can't definitively say whether it affects tourism or not. I kind of suspect that it's a red herring. Because living in Toronto, I was always marveled that, people assume that people in Buffalo wouldn't come up to shop in Toronto because someone might ask them for money. It's part of living in urban centers. Homelessness is not just in Victoria. There's nothing special about Victoria in that regard. You have that in every major city. And some people may be afraid of people who are homeless, but that's not justification to use law enforcement to deal with the problem, right? You're using law enforcement in that case to deal with what is a social problem. That person sitting on the streets is there because, as I say, they don't have a private place to go to. The fear of the public of people who are homeless, or the distaste that people feel, or the annoyance that people feel is not a justification for that, right? If you applied that to any other issue, right? If you said, I'm afraid to go downtown because the people down there have different skin color than me, right? Or because they're young, and we should act. That's just not true, right? My fears and my concerns and my prejudices do not require that kind of state action, right? If we're concerned about the visibility of homelessness, then we have to deal with homelessness by getting people housed and the supports they need, not using policing. So whether it's I don't know of any evidence that suggests that people don't come to Victoria because there are homeless people. That would be kind of hard to capture because it's a negative option thing, like did you not come because you were worried about that? But I think we overblow that. I don't believe it's as big a factor as we often imagine.
Thank you. Okay, the best for last. Aside from this venue today, what should businesses do to help?
I think there's a lot, right? That your voice is an important voice, right? That gets heard, not just at the political level, at the community level. And so I think if the business community lines up and says we support doing things differently, that matters. There's different aspects of the business community that can play a role as well. Landlords, property managers. Can you work with the local community to arrange to have situations where people who are homeless can get access to your housing? And the good news, the deal is that you probably have tenants whose characteristics are very similar to the people who are homeless, but this time they come with supports. We need to have developers think about getting back into the business of developing low-cost rental housing, because there are returns to be made on it. There's changes in construction standards, wood buildings. I think in BC now you can build 6-story buildings that reduce the cost of construction. There's ways of producing new housing stock. And employment. Can you work with the community to find ways to give people who have been excluded from employment a way back in, right? There's lots of ways that the business community can play a big role, both as advocate but also being directly part of the solution.
Thank you very much. I think we're just about ready to wrap up. Your presentation has been very enlightening and informative. We very much appreciate you taking the time to come all the way from Toronto. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Andrew Wynne Williams, the CEO for the Coalition, and Bruce Carter, the CEO for the Greater Victoria Chamber, for bringing us all together here today and organizing this, as well as Kelsey Stiles, who ran the event this morning and gave me my speaking notes. Very good. Thank you. We've all got a lot of work to do moving forward. I think everybody in this room is committed, so I look forward to working with you on this issue of homelessness moving forward. Thank you all for being here.